Hello. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to plan for automation. Now that you have some tools in your tool belt to automate the way you work with data, we're going to go over some techniques to plan for automation on your teams. Well, we like to say that automation is a workflow. We like to think of automation in a workflow, and we generally think that there's four stages. The first is requirements gathering. So that's gathering all the requirements of what the automation needs to do. The next stage is development. So that's developing all the code that you're going to be writing. Um, the third stage is testing. Now, there's two levels of testing. There's obviously the testing that you're doing while you're developing, but then there's also unit testing and kind of formal testing that you do after the development is done. And then there's a stage of deploying that automation to your team and the users, and then maintaining that automation over time. So we like to think of these as the four stages of automation workflow, and each of these is really important. Let's look at requirements gathering. So, there's many ways to do this, but one way that we found to be highly successful is by creating process maps of your data flow. So you may be working on a data set, and every day you have some particular tasks that you have to do to this data. And maybe it's all in your head, or maybe it's all in your user's head. Well, what we like to do is we like to get that process out in a process map. And this is maybe a high level of what a process map looks like. If we zoom in, you can see, so macro paste. So maybe yours doesn't say macro. Maybe you say that you paste new file data into new tab. Now you sort data by some field, and then by another field, and then you do a check. You say, is there one of these fields per these fields, and if yes, do this, if no, do this. And again, maybe this is all just in your head and kind of native knowledge of your team. Well, the first thing you want to do when you're automating is get that process into a formal process map like this. That does a couple things. One, that allows you to automate. As a developer, automating off of a cheat sheet like this makes the development work really simple. Number two, it sets up an SOP for your team and formalizes that SOP. And as we can see, that's going to be really important when you move on, because if things change uh, in the process map, it's going to screw up it's going to break your macro and shut it down. And so what we need to do is this is going to help us institute a change control process. So process mapping, requirements gathering, process mapping, this is really important in terms of starting an automation. We like to use Visio. You know that you can use PowerPoint. There's many different software tools that allow you to do this, and there's many different formats. This is kind of a highly visual one that we like to use, but we've used other formats too, and whatever your team is comfortable with, and you are comfortable with as a developer, that's what you want to use. Okay, so once you get the process map set and everybody agrees upon it, now you can get into your coding. Now this is the fun part, right? This is what we've been learning today. And so this is you going out, creating a new workbook, and starting to think through how that this is all going to be implemented in code, and writing the VBA and creating new subs and functions and organizing everything. So this is the fun part to me. And so this is where you're going to start coding. And then one thing we haven't talked about yet is creating the user interface. So your macro, you probably, the thing that tends to happen is you create a macro or some data automation, and then maybe you use it for personal use, but eventually someone else is going to take that over. And so what you're going to want to do is design a user interface for them. And typically what we do is we create this in a new worksheet in the workbook, and then you can have some fun graphic designing. And this is my favorite part of creating macros, because you get to have a little bit of fun showing them the steps, creating buttons for them, and then having what this does is as the macro is running, this will update and tell them kind of what's happening throughout the run of the macro. And so this is the real fun part. And here's another example of a user interface, um, and another example, and another example. So you can see that creating these user interfaces is really graphical and fun, and the idea is to simplify it down to make it the easiest no-brainer for any analyst or user who's going to come use it. So that's the fun part. So that all kind of falls under the development stage. You're going to do your coding, you're going to create your user interface. Now we come to testing. And so testing is a major part of creating macros, and it's one that often developers underestimate, but it actually can take the most amount of time, and that is testing your macro. So here's a tip. The first thing you're going to want to do is create a manual source of truth for your automation. So let's say that you're taking some data here and you need to transform it to this data. Now, normally you would do that manually, right? So here's your original data, you do a bunch of manual work, and then here's your output. Well, when you're developing a macro, what you want to do is do that same thing. So take this data set and then go through it manually, make sure you nail it and you get it just perfect, and then save this somewhere and call that your manual source of truth. Now you get into your development. So, hey, I'm starting to code out my macro to actually do this work for me. The output of that macro here, we're going to compare against this source of truth. And this is how you're going to test whether your macro is working correctly. Now, like I just said, this often is a step that developers overlook. So they hurry up and they get into development and they get some output, but then, man, going back and finding all the little errors that tend to arise is a big challenge. And you'd be surprised at how long it takes to find each little nuance. And so having this manual source of truth to compare this against can save so much time in the lifespan of a development project. So this is a really good idea. Okay, so we have that concept down, the manual source of truth. The other thing that is really helpful is to set up data sets with multiple variations. So here's you took this one data set, you built your macro around it, and here it is here, the output, and let's say that's good. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have a whole bunch of other variations of that data set that you could encounter. So for instance, maybe this data set doesn't have data in a particular field where this one does, and you were developing it with that in mind. And so now when you run this variation through it, it's going to break because you just haven't accounted for the fact that one of the fields doesn't have data in it. And there's per the project, there's lots of variations of that, of the variations that could happen in a data set. So, and it's going to be unique to every project. So just as you are starting to do your development, think through this, think through all the variations that could come in the data set, and find data sets that reveal those variations, so that as you're building and as you're testing, you can have the macro be confronted by these variations. So that's testing. It's a big deal, and you got to get this right. Everybody likes automation, but no one likes automation that doesn't work, that gives you wrong output. And so these are two tricks that you can do to overcome that. Okay, then we're going to get into that should say deployment, sorry. So deployment and maintenance. So the idea is to deploy a finished product to a user. And so once you've done testing, you're going to create and update any documentation that you think you need to pass this macro on. Maybe it's maybe it's user instructions, like step-by-step user instructions. And maybe it's documentation within the macro. So you write little notes to yourself in the macro telling you what's happening at each stage. Um, Here we're going to, you may set up a WebEx and you may want to train your users for the first couple times that they're using it, train them how to use it. And then really important, you want to institute change control processes around that data. So in other words, let's say that this is the original data that you take in, that your macro takes in, transforms, and does something with. Well, just imagine if you've programmed this whole thing out, everything's working beautifully, and then let's say the team that hands you this data adds a column in between these two columns. You know, if you haven't coded your macro to be dynamic in that way, there's ways to do it. But if you haven't done that, you're going to have to go back and make adjustments to the macro to have this new set of data with this new column work for you. So and you know, sometimes they have to make changes, and that's okay. But having instituting a change control process will give you as the macro developer a heads up. You won't come in on a Tuesday morning thinking everything's okay, and then all of a sudden you get 50 emails because you know a macro is not working that you developed. Well, whereas if you would have had like a week's heads up on that, hey, we're going to add a column here. All of a sudden now you have time to go back and add that column in and adjust your code, and everything will work great. The second thing that happens a lot is if your macro goes out to, like, let's say your macro goes out to SharePoint and it grabs and opens a folder and a file, and then it uses that file in some way. Well, you know, one thing that can happen is managers can come in and they can reorganize these folders and rename them and restructure them, and so all of a sudden now your macro is pointing to one folder that doesn't exist anymore, and again you get a crash in the macro. Not hard to fix, but it can send out some red flags and make your macro look bad. Whereas if you just institute a change control process, that will let people know, hey, if I'm going to make any updates here, I need to warn the macro developer that that's going to happen. So that's it. Again, we think of automation development in 4 stages, and there's some iterations in these stages, um, but you get the idea that we start by gathering requirements, we do our development work, we develop our macros and our user interfaces, and we test them as we're developing, and then we test our macro against multiple data sets, and we have a source of truth to compare it against, and then we deploy that, and then we maintain it. And so this is if you can get to thinking this way, and if you can get your teams to thinking this way, you guys can automate quite a bit of your work and actually restructure how your teams are organized.